Football fans chanting happily away. You can often hear that general chanting sound in the background of televised matches, but what you never hear are the specific chants. You know, the nasty, vile, and often, has to be admitted, very funny references to some aspect of a player's life or his appearance or the team's origins. I mean, Scotland fans in Italy singing "Deep fry your pizza, we're going to deep fry your pizza," or Newcastle fans after scoring away at FC Zurich, "You're not yodelling anymore." Or this compound of ugly stereotypes sung by Manchester United fans whenever their Korean Ji-sung Park plays. "Park, park, wherever you may be, you eat dogs in your own country. It could be worse, you could be scouse, eating rats in a council house." But there's another class of ugly chant, which anyone who's been to a football match will recognise, the chants about a player's alleged homosexuality. And could it be a fear of this terrorist assault which lies behind the unreadiness of professional footballers to admit to being gay? And that's quite some unreadiness. There are about 500,000 professional football players in the world. Not one of them is openly gay. And I've filched that extraordinary statistic from the report of a research project on homophobia in football, compiled by Jamie Cleland and Ellis Cashmore, a project which involved questioning a sample of 3,400 fans, professional players, managers, coaches and referees. Ellis Cashmore, who is Professor of Culture, Media and Sport at Staffordhire University, now joins me together with David Goldblatt, the author of The Ball is Round, A Global History of Football. Let me start off with you, first of all, Ellis, talking about this business of that statistic. 500,000 professional football players in the world, not one of them is openly gay. Are you sure?
No. Let's be upfront about that. I mean, I don't know how many professional footballers there are. I don't think I'm far out with that one, though, Laurie. You have to approximate, because obviously there are players turning
I just suddenly started thinking about minor leagues in Belgium.
Every day. Professional. Now, we're talking about professional, and Dave is probably going to temper my figures a bit if I am that far out. But I think about 500,000 would be about right. But I can be concretely sure about one thing, and that is that none of them have come out as being openly gay. And, of course, one of the purposes behind this project was to try to discover the reasons why that is so.
I mean, nobody in the UK, because, I mean, people were remembering...
Well, there has been one historically.
They were remembering Justin Fashanu,
of
weren't
course.
they?
Yes,
just remind me of that case, because he didn't come out himself. He was outed, wasn't he?
Well, he actually did volunteer to come out, but only when he sensed that he was going to be outed anyway. So he took, I suppose, I wouldn't call it the path of least resistance, because he had rather a torrid time as a result of that. Eventually moved to the United States, came back, and in the 1990s committed suicide. I don't think that was a direct result of his homosexuality, by the way, but... It probably was a contributory factor, because we know that life for a footballer who has come out as being gay is not, or wasn't, particularly pleasant. What we try to find out is how unpleasant, or perhaps, whether it is unpleasant for a footballer today.
You were looking, as I said before, at a wide range of attitudes, fans, players, referees, management.
Yes.
But you did an online survey.
It was all online.
Why online? Why not go around and ask people?
Because we didn't think we'd get any kind of candour or frankness. Let's face it, when you're doing research like this, you don't march up to a fan on his way to a club on a Saturday afternoon with a clipboard and say, "Excuse me, mate, have you got 5 minutes? I want to discuss your attitudes to homosexuality, in particular gay football." Not going to work, is it? So we put an online survey together. I've got to admit, this is the first time I've done any research online, but it's quite an exciting experience.
You did get a really quite extraordinary phenomenon. I mean, you've got 93% of the respondents, most of whom fans, not professionals, said there was no place for homophobia in football, and over 90% said the sexuality of a player was irrelevant. And you can't have expected that, can you?
Isn't that a surprise? Because, the whole survey was conducted against the background of characterisations of football being stuck in the dark ages and steeped in homophobia. And football fans out there will recall that a campaign to stamp out homophobic chanting, such as the stuff you've just mentioned, was withdrawn at the last moment. So against this background of people suspecting that this is a culture marred in homophobia. We found exactly the opposite.
Were you surprised, David Goldblatt, about these findings?
Yes and no. I mean, I wasn't surprised in the sense that that's what I expect of any group of people, really, in the contemporary UK. I mean, attitudes towards homosexuality and gender have been transformed in the last 20 or 30 years, and the demographic makeup of the football crowd has been transformed as well, and there's not actually a huge difference between the sort of general sample of the population and who you would find in a football ground. Obviously more masculine than feminine, but that aside. And my sense is amongst football fans, you know, the attitudes that are, you know, currently tolerant of homosexuality, that's what I would expect. And I think what is so interesting and so brilliant about Ellis's research is to turn the spotlight of this debate away from the problem of homophobia in crowds as the threat to footballers coming out and the way in which homophobia is maintained, and puts the spotlight very firmly on the inner sanctum of football, on the culture in the dressing room of players, of agents, of coaches, and managers.
That's where, by the way, David, the respondents to the research feel that the prohibition lies. They feel that gay footballers aren't coming out, not necessarily because of the crowds, but because they feel that their clubs are advising them against it, and if not their clubs, their agents, for commercial reasons.
I mean, if we're looking around for other reasons why they might come, I suppose we've got to talk a little bit about the masculine nature of football. And yet we've just recently had an example, haven't we, of a well-known rugby player declaring that he was gay, even though rugby seems really rather a more testosterone-fueled game than soccer.
Different kinds of masculinity at work here, though. I mean, rugby, I would say, has always been more comfortable in the touching of male bodies, of, you know, the camaraderie of getting drunk and singing, of the physicality of the game actually on the pitch. I mean, you're putting your hands in places when you play rugby that you're not when you play football. And I think rugby actually has been more comfortable with that, and in football there is much more of a prohibition.
Is it the middle classness, perhaps? Is that another factor? I mean, rugby players do tend to be rather more middle class than the average soccer player.
I think this is true, though, of rugby league as well, you know, which is a very working class game. I wonder whether this, at least in part, has got really deep roots back into the 19th century. I mean, it does occur to me that football is born, particularly football, is born of a moment of incredible moral panic about masculine sexuality in Victorian society. You know, football, in particular football within the public schools, is considered to be a tool for controlling self-abuse amongst the boys. And the purity movement of the late 19th century, which advocates all kinds of impossible sexual restraint amongst men, you know, to make sure that they still have enough spunk to serve the empire. You know, football is seen as a prophylactic, as a way of dealing with that. So we have, and Lord Kinnaird, I mean, you know, one of the early and great administrators of the Football Association, you know, scored a goal in the 1872 FA Cup, is a massive supporter of the purity movement in this era. So I think we have all sorts of problems, you know, basically very repressed attitudes to sexuality and masculine sexuality in the culture all the way back.
Let's move from that fascinating historical set of observations just to a couple of points from the survey, and whether or not we would accept the idea that with 8 out of 10 people responding to the survey saying that having openly gay players could have the same positive effect on football as black players did in the 80s and 90s when racism, the terrorism was killed off.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that's a reasonable parallel? We get a few footballers coming out and all of a sudden, you know, that the homophobic chanting begins to be reduced.
Well, that's what happened in the 1980s because those of us who are old enough to remember the first generation of black players, the likes of Cyril Regis and Laurie Cunningham et al., can remember the kind of abuse that they had to put up with,
people,
in particular. But, I mean, the first generation, and then gradually, of course, there were so many black players who were so prodigiously good that it became ridiculous to chant.
And also on your side.
So eventually it just wasn't sustainable. So that removed the whole point of racist chanting. And I think out of that came a new kind of enlightenment and a rediscovery that, you know, skill is what really matters. And that is still the abiding point that comes through this research, that fans and players are interested in only one thing, and that is performance on the field of play. Everything else is immaterial to fans.
But the difference here is, though, of course, that and
visibility.
I'm just interested because when people are shouting out and suggesting that people are puffs or gay or queer or whatever, in many cases this is almost like a generalised insult. It's a generalised reference to what they see as some sort of effeminacy. It's not directed to any known property of the player, mostly, is it? It's just a generalised term of abuse.
Well, this is why you have to kind of tap into the logic of the football fan, because they don't see it as homophobic abuse. They say that it's stick. We're giving players stick. It's a way of getting our men an advantage and disadvantaging, putting off the other players by chanting homophobic. So they create a homophobic environment, or something that sounds very much like a homophobic environment, but they say, we have nothing against gay players. In fact, we like more transparency. We like to remove this culture of secrecy and have players who would openly come out. Once they do, then there would be several more that followed, and that would be good for the game.
What do you think about this idea that some people coming out are going to reduce the homophobic chanting, or the idea that really this homophobic chanting is not really homophobic, it's just searching around for any term of abuse which will unsettle the opposition?
Well, I think the people you've got to ask whether it's homophobic are gay players and gay people, because they're on the end of it. So I think it's down to them to actually make that decision. That said, I think it would be the most extraordinary thing if one leading player, at a leading club were to actually come out. It would be one of the most extraordinary cultural events in sport.
And fans are saying that will happen. They're quite confident it will happen. But not for 2 years, they're saying.
I mean, it would rearrange people's headspace to find, a leading member of the England team to come out as gay. It would be absolutely extraordinary in this country.
You've talked about it not being the fans, but the other element which we haven't talked about at all are commercial interests, aren't there? There's always the idea that really that sponsorship is going to be affected. And for at least some leading footballers who might be exactly the type of role models that you're talking about, the risk of losing their advertising purchase is going to be a factor, isn't it?
It depends how you play it. I mean, marketing people are smart enough to know there's a lot of gay people buying branded sports goods in this world.
And it hasn't affected popular entertainers in music and movies, etc. So, and in a great many other sports. It's almost, the fans are almost embarrassed about this. They're saying, we look at every other major sport in the world, and they've created an environment, a culture in which it's okay for someone to come out, male or female, and say, I'm gay. But football, it hasn't happened yet. Why not?
Just one moment to squeeze in the last slightly contradictory finding of survey. 78% thought that a gay player would face hostility from fans. It doesn't seem to square easily with the 93% who said there was no place for homophobia.
They all think it's the guy next door. They're saying, well, just because we're not homophobic, that doesn't mean to say that we don't hear it week in, week out. And you put the point that you made earlier is that there's almost this parroting of homophobic abuse, to no one in particular, but almost abstractly. And they know that it goes on. And so they're not naive enough to think that it would cease overnight if a gay player came out. It'd probably crank it up, actually, for a few weeks. But the point is that the Gareth Thomas, the rugby player you cited earlier, I mean, he hasn't had such a tough time. He had a bit of a problem at one ground earlier this year, but overall the experience hasn't been that bad for him.
OK. Ellis Cashmore and David Goldblatt, thank you both very much.